Do grab your seats. It's really good to be with you this morning. And it's such a privilege. It was great that Tim was able to reach out and we were able to connect some dates together. So as Tim said, I'm going to be with you a couple of times through this next term. But it's summer. You may have realized sometimes you say that and you're never quite sure because it's been raining constantly. But it feels like right now it is summer. But summer is often a time of slowing down, resting. Certainly in church worlds, it kind of feels like we try and shut things down and give some space. But I don't know what your summer's been like in terms of rest and slow down, on reflection. But I want to give us an opportunity this morning to do that. To think about what has been and to think about what is to come. And as I was thinking about that, as a family, we went to Scotland last week, and we went to Edinburgh for the day. And I was kind of looking around. I'd been once before, quite a while ago. But I was looking up at the castle. I don't know if you've been to see the castle or you've seen a photograph of the castle, but it sits on the top of the hill. And as you look down from the city, or look up to it from the city, you just see this mass castle of wall and building, and I imagine that they every so often have to go around and check that it's all safe and secure. But the thing that struck me was that it was on a rock. Its foundations were solid. It doesn't matter how good and how safe the walls were if the foundations weren't right. And this solid piece of rock on which they built the castle. And it just got me thinking about not just reflecting on how life is going, how career and job and community and all these different things, but how's the foundation that it's built on? And foundations are often very simple things. And so perhaps today the message that we're going to look at is quite a simple message. But I just felt like God wanted to remind us of the foundation, of Him, as we reflect this summer. Luke's gospel says it's the wise person that builds their house on a rock. So that's what we want to be. We want to be wise people building everything that God is doing on a rock. And so we're going to look at it through a person of the Bible. And so that's got me asking a question of you. I love to get you kind of thinking and chatting to each other first. So who, now the answer is going to be Jesus, obviously. So let's park Jesus. Other than Jesus, who inspires you the most in the Bible? If you've never read the Bible, that's absolutely fine. Who inspires you to think differently, to think bigger, to think beyond yourself? But for those that know some Bible characters, who's the one that you go to or that most reflects who you are? Chat to the person next to you. Tell them, who is it that is the character that speaks to you most? Brilliant. It's always the problem. Once you get people chatting, getting them back again can be quite tricky. Give me some shouts out. Who have we been chatting about? Which characters have you been talking about? I heard of Joshua down here. That's Daniel. Daniel, my Daniel's just gone, yes. God himself. Yep. I missed that one. Deborah. Fantastic. Any other characters that we chatted about? Ruth. David. I'm going to look at Mary Magdalene. Fantastic. Well, you can keep those conversations going over coffee, finding out who the characters. We're not going to do any of those people. Joshua is mine. He's the one that often God speaks to me most about in terms of who he's made me to be and that sense of call Joshua and going into the promised land. And Joshua, but I've spent a bit of time recently thinking about Nehemiah as well. And I think a number of church communities have been thinking about Nehemiah, particularly as we come out of COVID and what it means to rebuild in a world that has been broken down. We're not going to look at any of them today. We're going to look, if you've got your Bibles, why don't you turn to 2 Samuel chapter 4. And we're going to start at the first verse. And we're going to look at 2 passages, both in 2 Samuel. So 2 Samuel chapter 4, starting at the first verse. When, for some reason, I picked a passage that had lots of names in, and I'm rubbish with names. So this should be fun. When Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were leaders of the raiding bands. One was named Benah, and the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, from the tribe of Benjamin. Beeroth is considered part of Benjamin because of the people of Beeroth, fled to Gittaim, and have resided there as foreigners to this day. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. We're going to stop there. A 5-year-old boy called Mephibosheth is who I want us to look at today. But let me just give you some context. There's fighting in the land. There's alarm and there's confusion and there's fear. There's a lot of uncertainty. God's people have decided that they wanted a physical king. And so God gave them what they wanted, and Saul was appointed as king. He turned from God, started to do his own thing and made bad choices. And so God decided that he would appoint a second, the new king, David. And a battle pursued. This battle of leadership, this battle of control, this battle of who was going to lead God's people. Saul jealous because things had been taken away. For God's people, there was a sense of turmoil, a sense of uncertainty, fear, loss. Who are we? Who leads us? What's going on? It feels a little bit like God's people today are in that place. What's going on? There's battles raging, cultural battles, physical battles in our world. Where's God in the midst of it? What's he doing? Who's he calling to step up and to lead? What's my part in this? Questions, how does it fit? Where does church fit in to all of this? Lots of questions. But in the midst of it, we've got a dynasty going on. Saul, we mentioned, had a son, Jonathan. And he had a son, Mephibosheth. This would have been the line in which the king would be passed down. And through this battle, David and Saul have become enemies. Saul fighting because of his jealousy and desire to stay king. But David and Jonathan are friends. Best of friends. Committed to each other. And as we read here in this passage, the battle continues that Saul and Jonathan are killed, leaving the rest of Saul's family in fear. They were going to be the line of kings. They were going to be the rulers of God's people. They had all of this land and possession as a consequence. But Saul was dead. Jonathan was dead. And in fear, because in culture, even today, when that fear of a family still exists, people will try and eradicate. It was the same then. Saul's family, Jonathan's family, in fear, ran. They didn't want to die as well. And in that process, it says there that the nurse picked Mephibosheth up, and in the rush to get away, he was dropped. And I assume his legs were broken, which meant he was disabled. Mephibosheth had lost everything. He'd lost his status, the king's grandson. He'd lost the land. It had been taken from them. He'd lost his home, his family, his health. And all that meant. Being lame in that time was a sign of sinfulness, of separation from the rest. He'd become an outcast. And he would remain that for the next 15 to 20 years. Living in a place separated from everyone else, in constant fear of being found, hidden from view. And we jump in our story. David has victories. David begins to take his role as king. And in 2 Samuel chapter 9, it says this. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's house named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king answered, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in the Lodabar." Sounds like something out of Star Wars, doesn't it, Lodabar? Lost it now. So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth, at your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" The king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "Are you giving your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family? You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson will be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." In a place of desperation, in a place of brokenness, forgottenness, David remembers. Remembers a promise that he made to Jonathan. A love that he had for that family, that he wanted to seek out and find any remaining family members. And in the search, he finds Mephibosheth. 15 to 20 years later. And the story, as we've read, says that David wanted to show kindness. Mephibosheth will be thinking, uh-oh, now's the time. He's got me. This is my end. David will want to get rid of me because I'm in the line of Saul and I could take the land back. I could take his crown back. But David appears and it says he wanted to show kindness. He wanted to show mercy. David restores Mephibosheth. He restores his land to him, a place of inheritance and a place of provision. All that he needed to sustain him and his family. And more importantly, he gave him a seat at his table, at the table of the king. In that culture, an invitation to sit at the king's table was the invitation of a family member, of a son. It wasn't just somewhere to eat, but it was a place of intimacy with the king that declared Mephibosheth as one of David's sons, adopted into the family. How does this speak of foundations for us? Perhaps it already is speaking to you. A familiar story in our house, as I've been thinking about this week. My kid said the chances of you getting that name right every single time, Mephibosheth, is pretty slim. And I've not done a bad job, but to be honest, in this week, as I've thought about it, I've found it much easier to shorten his name to me. The story of Mephibosheth is the story of me. It's who we are. We're a rescued people. A king extending mercy to his people. Undeserved, unwarranted, unearned. He reaches out to us in loving kindness and says, he's your inheritance, the kingdom of heaven. He's your provision, everything that you will need. Have a seat at my table. You are my children, sons and daughters of the King, adopted into his family. This is our story, hidden in the chapters of 2 Samuel, speaking before Jesus would come, but speaking of a life lived out for him then and for us now. And it's a story we need to tell. I love the sign on the door, you are now entering the mission field. It's a story we need to tell to those out in the world who are lost and broken and have nothing. Increasingly, the world that we live in which finance is meaning that people literally have nothing. It's a story that we can tell of God's kindness and goodness. But I think this morning we need to remember it for ourselves. And we're going to come to the table that reminds us of Jesus and all that he did in bread and wine. We're going to remember what he did. And for some of us, we just need to be reminded afresh of God's kindness and goodness that invites us into relationship with him. And some of you might be thinking, I know this. But I was struck because as you read on that story, Mephibosheth loses his inheritance again. Ziba, that one that brought Mephibosheth to the king, tricks Mephibosheth and David ends up giving all the land to Ziba. The complication gets figured out. David is committed to that decision that he made. So in the end, gives half of the land back to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth ends up with half the land. Ziba ends up with half the land. But Mephibosheth's response is, I just want King David to reign. Actually, the land doesn't matter. I want you to reign. But as you read those chapters, in that bit of story, one thing struck me. It seems that Mephibosheth stopped sitting at the king's table. He stopped spending time in the presence of the king. And so he knew it in his head, but he didn't experience it in reality. And so he could be tricked to lose out on the things that God had given. Perhaps for some of us today, we know it. You listen to the story of Mephibosheth and you think, yep, I know this. But at the same time, we've forgotten it. We've forgotten the reality of being in the presence of the king, the invitation to sit at his table, to be in the place of intimacy, to not just hear from him when we come to church on a Sunday or in our communities or however we do life together, but every day, encountering his presence and receiving from him. So we're going to move into communion, the place of remembering. And the words that we're going to use are the words of being invited to the table, to come and receive from him. But as we do that, allow God's Spirit to remind you afresh. It might be that you've never heard that story. You've never realized the truth of what you've come to church. You've been going to church. Perhaps you've been going to church your whole life. But the truth of the invitation you've not heard before. Or perhaps, like Mephibosheth, you know it in your head, but you've forgotten the experience of it in your heart and in your life. And you just want to come and say, let me receive all that you have. As I take bread and wine, remembering Jesus' death, paying the price, receive that place of intimacy and grace from him. So let's just take a moment. I've said a lot, but what's God saying to you today? How does he want to encourage you? Father, we thank you. We thank you for this story, and we thank you for the truth of it in our lives. That you, the King of Kings, the Lord of heaven and earth, reach out a hand towards us and invite us to sit at your table. That you restore us to the place that you created for us, and that you give us all that we need in provision. And so, Holy Spirit, come and minister to your people today.